Unit 40, Business Letter Format and Letter Style. So the question is, just how many parts of a letter are there? Do you remember from the reading? Well, there are 4 parts of a letter. Do you remember what the 4 parts are? Well, we have the heading, the opening, the body, and the closing. Let's look at each one of these a little bit more in depth. So we have the heading. Now, while you need to know what the 4 main parts are, you also need to know what each one of the sub-parts are. So each of these bulleted underneath, like the heading here, these 4 will also be needed to be known for your tests. So make sure you're paying attention here. Okay, so in the heading, we have the letterhead, the date line, the personal or confidential notation, and the typed heading. So all 4 of these parts fall within the heading category. The second part of our letter is called the opening. The opening contains the inside address, the attention line, and the salutation. The third part is called the body, which consists of the subject line and your actual message, or the body of the letter. And part number 4 is called the closing. Now there's a lot listed here. They don't all necessarily appear in a letter, but of the possibilities that could be in the letter, we have the complimentary closing, the company signature, the writer's signature, the writer's ID, the reference initials, the enclosure notations, the mailing notations, and the CC, BCC, and PS. Now, while this sounds like a lot, these last 3, the PS I'm sure you have seen. It goes at the very end. These all appear in order that they would appear on the page. But the PS would appear at the very end. Do you remember what PS stands for? PS stands for postscript. It's kind of like an afterthought, after script, after writing. It's an afterthought to what you had said. The CC stands for carbon copy. Back 100 years ago when I was in school, and I was in college and we had to write a term paper. We always kept a copy for ourselves in case the professor lost it, the teacher lost it, something happened to it, you never know. So we always kept a copy. We did not have computers. It was not a luxury that we had where we could just save and print out a couple of copies and that printout was ruined, so I'll just print out another one. When you typed, it went straight on the paper and that's all there was of it. So we had this stuff called carbon paper. So you had your first sheet of paper, then you put this carbon paper in, and then a second sheet of paper. So anything written on the top sheet would go through the carbon paper and appear on the second sheet. So that's what CC stands for. It stands for carbon copy. Now, if I was sending a letter to, say, Mrs. Hebert, and I wanted Mrs. Kramer to know that I wanted Mrs. Kramer to also have a copy of this, I would put CC, and then Mrs. Kramer. So Mrs. Hebert would know that Mrs. Kramer got a copy of this letter as well, and then obviously Mrs. Kramer would know that Mrs. Hebert was the original recipient of this letter. Then between the CC and the PS, you see I've got a notation of BCC. BCC stands for blind carbon copy, which means that if I wanted Coach Ramos to also have a copy of this, but I didn't want Mrs. Hebert or Mrs. Kramer to know that Coach Ramos got a copy of this, I would have at the bottom of my letter, so at the top of the letter it would be addressed to Mrs. Hebert, then at the bottom of the letter it would be CC, Mrs. Kramer, and then BCC, Coach Ramos. So Mrs. Hebert would know that Mrs. Kramer had a copy, but would not know about Mr. Ramos getting a copy, and Mrs. Kramer would know Mrs. Hebert got the original letter, but she would also not know that Coach Ramos got a copy of this letter. But Coach Ramos would know that Mrs. Kramer got a copy of it and that the original went to Mrs. Hebert. So that's a CC and a BCC and PS. That's what those all stand for. All right, let's move on. So those are the four main parts of the letter. Now, what if your letter goes to a second page? Well, in this case, you only use plain paper, not letterhead. It should be the same size and quality, and the heading should be in the top left corner, vertical aligned, followed by 3 blank lines. It should have the addressee's name, the page number, and the date. So what about the envelope? Well, when addressing envelopes, start the address 1.5 inches from the top of the envelope and about 2 inches from the left margin. Should be single spaced, all the addresses should be single spaced, and use block format. Continuing with the envelope, as with letters, the address should be full name, job title, place of employment, street address, city, state, and zip. If there's an attention line, it should go below the city, state, and zip, leaving 1 blank line between them and typed as attention in all caps followed by a colon. Be sure to type a return address if none appears on the letterhead. And this would go in the upper left corner of the envelope front. So here's an example of a letter. So can you name each of the parts of this letter starting from the top? At the very top, what would it be called? Hopefully you know this. You should know that this is the date. Then we have the inside address, followed by the salutation. This is the subject line. Then the body is the entire message, the meat of your letter. This is followed by the complimentary close, the writer, reference initials, which actually is a very outdated kind of a notion. Very rarely do you see reference initials. This used to be when people had secretaries and the secretaries would type the letters. Typically a boss would dictate a letter to a secretary. The secretary would then type it up and the boss would then sign it. So the reference initials would be the person who dictated the letter would be in all caps and then usually like a backslash, and then in lowercase letters the person who actually did the typing of the letter, in this case like a secretary. So those are the reference initials. And finally, the enclosure notation. Now, if there is only one thing being enclosed, it's just simply enclosure. If you have 2 items that are being enclosed, then you would just simply put an S on the end of that word, so it would be enclosures. If you have 4, 5, or more things that you're enclosing in the letter, good practice is to say enclosures, and then leave a space, and then open parentheses, 5, and then close parentheses. So this way the recipient knows to check, and that beyond the letter, there should also be 5 other things that have been enclosed in the envelope. All right. So here we have proofreader marks. Now notice that these are funny little squiggles. At the very top, we have this thing that starts in the lower left-hand corner and goes up and squiggles around to the upper right-hand corner. This means takeout. So you can see in the example, it originally had Y-O-O-U-R, your bill. So we've got the takeout symbol, and so the practice, it would be your bill. Okay, so term annual, we've taken that out. We've changed that to an I, not a U, an I. So it's now terminal. Instead of benefit, we're inserting the letter E, so it's now benefit. We're inserting the word it, so instead of send now, it says send it now. A pound sign represents in business a space. So instead of the program, it's the program. Instead of form at, we're going to close this up, so it's now format. Down below, we have computer is misspelled, so it's C-O-M-P-T-U-E-R. So we use the transverse or transpose or reverse order symbol. So we now have computer spelled correctly. The next one down is capital D, capital R, period. Well, we put an LC here because this really, the second letter should be lowercase for Dr. Hampton. 3 underlines mean to capitalize this letter, so it's Ms. Adams, A being capitalized. A circle around a dot means we need to add a period there. So maybe Dr. Deal, there was no period, so we need to put one in. We're going to add whatever punctuation. In this case, it's a comma. It could be a period. It could be a semicolon. So we're going to have red, comma, green, comma, or blue. Leave as is. Now maybe the person had written flight number and I should have crossed out 330. So the little dots underneath would mean leave it the way it was originally. So it would stay as flight number 330. To spell out something, as in Palmyra, New York. We want Palmyra spelled out the words New York. Room 305 should be right underneath the M in Mrs. Hastings. And in the move right, the number 2 should be underneath the number 1 and above the number 3, as it is over in the example. The other part of the proofreader's marks look like this. So we have center it. So notice should be centered above the date. DS means double space. When you double space something, you're leaving one blank paragraph mark. Single space means it should be just one, and then you hit the enter key, and then the next line is typed right there. There's the new paragraph. So we have a very long, we've got 2 sentences here that should be broken up into 2 actual paragraphs. And then QS means quadruple space. When you quadruple space, you're hitting the enter key 4 times, but that leaves 3 blank lines. So single space, you're hitting the enter key 1 time, leaves no blank paragraph marks. Double space means you're hitting the enter key how many times? 2 times, which leaves 1 blank paragraph mark. To triple space, which would be TS, you would hit the enter key 3 times, which would leave 2 blank paragraph marks. And QS is quadruple space. We're hitting the return the enter key how many times? 4 times. And how many blank paragraph marks does that leave? Should be 3. There is a handout of this out in StudyWiz, so open it up, get to know it, because you will start to see these on some of the letters that you're going to be handing in.